Sarah, it's all yours.
All right. So thank you, Bill, for that introduction. Today I'll be talking to you all about my master's thesis research, as Bill mentioned, assessing the costs and benefits of different culture techniques on an Alabama commercial oyster farm. So to give you a little background, traditionally oysters have been wild harvested in the Gulf of Mexico and intended for the shucked meat market. However, as these populations have declined, states have imposed stricter regulations, which has limited the economic opportunities for harvesters, processors, and the like. And so we've seen a rise in a new industry of off-bottom oyster farming, in which oysters are grown in floating bags, baskets, or cages, as you see in the picture to the right. And these are usually intended for a higher-end half-shell market. These oysters usually receive a higher price as they are single set, and farmers have greater control over the aesthetic qualities of the oyster, as opposed to the wild counterparts, which are in clusters and grown on the bottom. So to put this industry in context, in Alabama, in 2009, there were no off-bottom oyster farms. However, in just 10 years, that number has grown to 22 farms. And in just last year, there were almost 2 million oysters harvested off-bottom. However, as more and more people are choosing to enter this industry, they're facing a lot of challenges, including things like permitting, seed supply shortages, changes in water quality, closures, and loss of crop, to name a few. And all of these challenges can affect both their yearly profits as well as the long-term sustainability of their businesses. One caveat being, however, all of these challenges are outside of a farmer's direct control. And so what my research wanted to look at is what can be done within a farmer's control to increase their profit margin and help mitigate some of the negative effects associated with these challenges. And so we sought to do this through two primary objectives. The first objective was how can we increase the value of oysters coming out of any given acre? And we did this through determining if buyers are able to recognize differences in oyster quality produced by different farm management methods. And if so, does that quality affect their willingness to pay in purchasing decisions? Our second objective was ensuring that the methods a farmer is using are economically sustainable over time as well. And we did this through actually generating a true accounting of farming production costs. So in order to test both of these objectives, we actually installed a model commercial off-bottom oyster farm that was run by high school students in Grand Bay, Alabama. The farm was installed in October of 2018, and we just wrapped up our sampling in January of this year. So on the farm, we used one of the more popularly used culture systems in the Gulf called the adjustable longline system. In the system, oysters are grown in baskets, which are suspended on lines and then attached to clips so that they can either be raised or lowered within the water. The picture to the right actually shows a bird's eye view of what our farm looks like. So we installed a total of 16 of these long lines running parallel to one another on a total of 1 acre. And we wanted to test a few different of the more commonly used management methods on our farm. So each of our adjustable long lines had a unique combination of these management methods applied to it, including the brand of gear a farmer can purchase, such as Hexel brand and SEPA brand gear. And these both differ by initial costs as well as durability. We tested 2 different tumbling frequencies, and tumbling is when oysters are sent through a long rotating cylindrical tube, and as they tumble, the outer shell is chipped away, producing a more consistent and desirable shape. And there's also different size holes that the oysters fall through to sort by size. And we tested whether this was done more frequently, once a month, or less frequently every 3 months. Next, we looked at 2 air drying frequencies, and air drying is when oysters are raised out of the water to reduce biofouling such as barnacles or algae that could affect the presentation of the oyster. And we tested whether this was done less labor intensively. The farmer is setting their baskets at a certain height and allowing them to dry as the tides come in and out daily, or more labor intensively. The farmer's actually going out once a week, raising all their baskets to dry for 24 hours, and then returning the next day to resubmerge them. And finally, we looked at 2 different ploidies of oyster seed a farmer can purchase to initially stock their farm. We looked at a less expensive natural diploid seed and a more expensive genetically modified triploid seed designed for its sterility and faster growth during those summer spawning seasons. So in total, we had 16 unique treatments, one of which was applied to each of our long lines. However, in spring of 2019, we actually had a storm roll through and damage the first 4 of our lines, which were all of those that included Hexel brand gear and monthly tumbling. And so we had to exclude those from our statistical analysis. So we ended up with a total of 12 treatments that we assessed. In order to assess the difference between the monthly and tumbling effect and how it interacted with drying and ploidy, we looked within our remaining SEPA baskets. And in order to assess the difference between the Hexel and SEPA brand gear, in addition to the drying and ploidy effect, we looked at those remaining Hexel and SEPA gear, both with quarterly tumbling. And for the sake of time today, we will just be looking at these 8 lines with the gear, drying, and ploidy effect. So for each of these treatment lines, once oysters grew to a standardized harvest size, we collected samples and sent them to both chefs and wholesalers across the United States, along with a blind survey in order to judge the quality of the oysters as well as potential profits. Also at harvest size, we took a few samples for ourselves back to the lab where we conducted a quantitative assessment of quality using published methods so that we could compare this to what our participants perceived in the survey. This here is an example of the survey that we sent out to our participants. So we sent out a total of 5 shipments, and each shipment contained between 4 and 6 of our treatment varieties. And each time, our participants were asked to rate these varieties on various shell and meat quality metrics, including shell shape, cleanliness, thickness, shuckability, shell consistency, meat to shell ratio, meat condition, and the consistency of the meat. And these were all rated from 1 to 5, 1 being very poor up to 5 being very good. We also asked our participants the price they'd be willing to pay per oyster at wholesale, in the order in which they would purchase the included treatment varieties. In the lab, we collected some data such as cleaning labor as a metric of cleanliness, fan, which is a ratio of shell height to length, and cup, which is a ratio of shell length to width as metrics of shell shape, and condition index, which is a ratio of dried tissue weight to the volume of the shell as a metric of meat to shell ratio. So as I mentioned previously, for our results today, we will just be looking at those 8 lines and how the gear, air drying, and ploidy affected quality in terms of both our quantitative assessment in the lab and our qualitative assessment from the survey. So up first, we're looking at fan ratio. Again, this is the ratio of shell height to length. So in the lab, we did not find an effect of gear. However, we did see an effect of drying and ploidy. Overall, we didn't see many significant differences among our treatment varieties. However, we did find that diploid oysters grown with weekly air drying had significantly lower fan ratios than other varieties. But even so, all exceeded what is considered the ideal fan ratio of 0.67. If we compare this to what our participants found in the survey, overall they did not see many significant differences in shell shape either, but they did all still rate them as being above average. And if we look just within the SEPA gear, which is to the right, they did also notice that those diploids grown with weekly air drying had slightly lower shell shape quality than the other SEPA varieties. Looking now at cup ratio, another factor of shell shape, this time how deep the oyster was. Again, we didn't see many significant differences among our treatment lines, but they did all still exceed the ideal ratio of 0.33. And if we compare these to those same shell shape scores from the survey, it still lines up pretty well in terms of not many significant differences, and they were still rated all above average. So moving on to condition index. Again, this is a metric of meat to shell ratio. So in the lab, we found that within both Hexel brand and SEPA brand gear, it appeared that diploids grown with daily air drying and triploids grown with weekly air drying had significantly higher condition indices than the majority of other treatments. In the survey, we didn't find an effect of gear or air drying. However, our participants scored triploids as having significantly higher meat to shell ratios than our diploid oysters. And this does align with the majority of what we found within the lab. They did not notice, however, the same increase in quality of daily air-dried diploids. To give an example of this, a diploid oyster is on the left. It's not a bad looking oyster in terms of meat to shell ratio. And our participants did score diploids as being above average. But when you put it next to a triploid oyster, which is practically overflowing in its shell, there is an observable difference in quality, which is probably what our participants perceived. So moving on now to quality metrics that were only included in the survey. First, we have shuckability, or how easy an oyster was to open. Here we did not find an effect of gear, only air drying and ploidy. And we found that triploids grown with daily air drying received the highest shuckability scores out of all treatments. Next, looking at the consistency of the shell. So each time a treatment line was shipped out, there was a sample of 6 oysters. So looking at how consistent the shell was within that sample. Again, there was no effective gear, only air drying and ploidy. And triploids grown with daily air drying still had high shell consistency scores in comparison to other treatment varieties, this time closely followed by their weekly air dried counterparts. Looking at the condition of the meat, so when the oysters were shucked open, how plump did that meat appear within the shell? This time, no effects of gear or air drying. However, triploids continued to exceed the quality of diploid oysters. And in the pictures, you see to the left is a diploid. Again, not a bad looking oyster, and our participants did still score it as above average. But when you put it in comparison to that very plump looking triploid, there's an observable difference in quality, which is again probably what our participants perceived. And finally, looking at the consistency of the meat within that sample, we found separate effects of ploidy and air drying. Triploids continued to exceed the quality of diploid oysters, and this time daily air drying treatments exceeded the quality of those with weekly air drying. So overall, yes, our buyers are able to recognize differences in oyster quality produced by different farm management methods. Our participants may not have been able to notice as minute differences as we noticed in the lab sometimes, but they did appear to notice the same trends overall. So when we assessed how quality affected what our willingness to pay, we ran a linear regression between the sum of all quality scores and the prices offered. And we found a positive linear relationship. So in general, our participants were willing to pay more for what they perceived as being higher quality. We ran the same analysis with purchase rank, and we found that participants were also more likely to purchase an oyster variety first, as that some quality score increased as well. Looking more specifically at which quality metrics affected willingness to pay in purchase rank, we found significant effects of shuckability, so how easy the oyster was to open, as well as the consistency of the oyster meat. Interestingly, however, we found that shell shape was significant in terms of purchase rank, but not willingness to pay. In a paper by Ruello, he mentions that an attractive oyster will gain attention even with a high price point, whereas an unattractive oyster is not seen as good value regardless of a cheap price point. And so we think this may explain why shell shape was significant in terms of the order our participant was willing to purchase an oyster, but not necessarily what they were willingness to pay. So looking here at these specific prices offered for our treatment varieties, again, no effective gear, and those triploids grown with daily air drying did receive the highest price at 68 cents an oyster, followed by weekly air dried triploids at 62 cents an oyster, and then both diploid varieties at 56 and 51 cents an oyster. To put these prices in context, the 2018 Situation Outlook Report reported a price range between 30 and 70 cents per oyster in Alabama, averaging at 46 cents. So all of our treatment varieties did receive prices well above that average, but they still varied significantly depending on the combination of management methods that were being used. So this brings us now to our second objective. Did the oyster varieties that received the highest prices actually have the most profitable farming operations? So to test this, again, we generated a true accounting of production costs for the operation of each treatment line. So for each treatment line, we collected data such as labor costs, biometrics like survival and harvest rates, as well as including the previously mentioned resulting prices to generate revenue. And all of these values were tracked in unique enterprise budgets, one for each unique treatment line. Each line was scaled up to a 1-acre farm, which was equivalent to the farm that was installed. And all of the values of cost and revenue were extrapolated for a total of 10 years of operation in order to account for initial slow growth associated with oyster farming. In order to actually assess how profitable each operation was, we used two values. The first was net present value, and the second was a 10-year modified internal rate of return. These were both calculated based on cash flows from the enterprise budgets. If both of these values were positive, then we deemed an operation to be profitable. However, if one or both were negative, then we deemed an operation to not be profitable. So this graph here shows a comparison of our production costs based on each treatment line. And I'll set these abbreviations up for you for both this slide and the next, in which the treatment line goes in order of gear type, tumbling, drying, and then ploidy. For example, that treatment line 5 is Hexel brand gear, quarterly tumbling, weekly air drying, and diploid oysters. So in the light green is fixed costs. This included things like gear and installation. And in the light blue were our variable costs that excluded labor. So things like fuel, seed costs, and maintenance. Overall, these costs didn't seem to vary much between our treatment lines. What had the highest effect on production costs was labor. And the treatment line that affected labor the most was air drying. And the more labor-intensive weekly air drying had higher labor costs than those with daily. Monthly tumbling did add some additional labor costs in comparison to quarterly tumbling, but not to the same magnitude that weekly air drying did. So finally, looking here at profitability, we found that yes, indeed, the three most profitable lines were those that included daily air drying and triploid oysters. This was generally followed by weekly air dried lines with triploid oysters, and then diploid lines with daily air drying, one of which was more profitable than the others, and one that was deemed to not be profitable. And finally, our weekly air dried diploids, two of those which were deemed to not be profitable. So in conclusion, all of the methods that we used in our study did produce what could be considered high quality oysters. But even so, our different farm management combinations produce perceivable differences in quality. and our participants were willing to pay more for what they perceived as being higher quality. In terms of our suggestions for farmers, we didn't see large effects of either gear type or tumbling frequency. So we suggest farmers base these on their personal preference or situation. We did, however, notice effects of the air drying frequency and ploidy. And so we suggest the use of both daily air drying and triploid oysters, as these produce the highest quality oysters in the most profitable farming operations. I'd like to take a second to acknowledge the numerous amounts of people who helped make this project possible, all the people at the Auburn Shellfish Lab, Alma Bryant, and of course my committee members. Brief overview here of my references, and I'd like to answer any questions you all might have.